10 to 15 of you haven't been here before, but surely almost everybody was drawn by the knowledge that they get a chance to hear Brenda Laurel speak. She's been involved in the community and inspiring it since BayCHI was founded in '89. Her book, Computers as Theater, came out that same year. I think we've always been learning from Brenda. So without any more, why don't we just hear what she has to say?
Okay then. I don't usually have a prosthesis on my back. I'm not used to it. And this microphone stand is going to be our audio for later. Hi, nice to see so many old friends, current friends who have aged with me gracefully and beautifully through these many years. And there's another one. How nice, how nice. So this talk is really a reflection, I guess. There's a trend that I'm sure you're aware of looking at greater connections between the humanities and technology, and learning how the two large territories can inform each other better than perhaps they have in the past. So I took a long look through my journey, which started in 1976 in this business, through the lens of trying to map the territory I've been through with that thought in mind of how the humanities and technology have woven together in that journey. And I know that I'll be recognizing connections that all of us have seen. This is not about me, this is about connections, and I'm talking about things I've done because I know what they are. So I hope you won't think me self-indulgent to take you on this little journey with me. So here's our title. You're looking at an antique map, which I've discovered a great affinity for. And the talk is dedicated to my PhD advisor in theater, who had the courage to let me pursue such a crazy subject as interactive fantasy with artificial intelligence in the theater department at Ohio State. We didn't have computers. We didn't have access to computers. The computer science department was Chuck Surrey's computer graphics department. And they thought I was insane. So Don Glancy, bless his heart, let me pursue my work, and I'll always be grateful to him. Here are some of the places I'm going to take you quickly tonight. These aren't really destinations. They weren't destinations. They feel like it now, looking back, but they're places where I stopped. They're like little countries that formed up while I was lucky enough to be there with certain constellations of people and ideas. So we're going to look at those things. And I want to start with the journey towards the book that Paul kindly mentioned. This is the Teatro Olimpico in Italy, and it covers everything that has turned out to be of interest to me in my career in technology. There's architecture, there's a history of architecture that shows up in the building. There are these forced perspective hallways. So for example, if you're an actor and you walked up one of these streets, you would look larger and larger because the buildings get smaller and smaller. It's like the trick they used in the Lord of the Rings. And they had the most magnificent special effects machinery in the Renaissance Theater. You don't see it in this picture, but the things that they did for special effects, Disney was informed by, and we are all informed by as we go on with our work. So that's kind of the beginning point for me, and this is not the same theater. This is the theater at Ohio State University, where I did a lot of work in Shakespeare and Gilbert and Sullivan, etc. But the conventional theater, although I loved it and kept doing it as long as I could, wasn't nearly as interesting to me as interactive theater and improvisational theater. Do we have any improv people here? All right, yes, I think it's a good thing for user interface folks to do. So this is the context here is that interactive theater was a really happening thing at the end of the 60s and the beginning of the 70s, and I'll mention a few of the plays that were going on then. This was a production of a script that I co-wrote with a friend called Robin Hood, taken from tales from the 9th to 11th century, so Marion had barely made an appearance. And we did it outdoors at Ohio State with mansion staging, and we tried to follow the commedia rule of having lazzi, that is little built pieces of business and actions that we knew had to happen, interspersed with material that could be interactive with the audience. You can see here, by the way, how closely my actors are paying attention to me as a director and how respectful they look. The play began with the jester, or the minstrel of Robin Hood's troupe, Alan and Dale, singing a song and bringing the children into the meadow where they would start to walk around and see these places where characters would appear, or deer in their special costumes. And then the kids would crowd around and they'd give the actors coaching. There's an argument going on here between Robin and Marion, and the kids are making suggestions already about how to fix the relationship. We had an audience of blind children at this show that was amazing. There was a big broadsword battle as part of the action, and the blind children got closer, and they were shouting things like, "He's behind you, he's left-handed." It was just remarkable. It never occurred to me that that would happen. Anyway, that brings me inches closer to a career in computers, and this is an image that I saw with a friend of mine at Battelle Memorial Laboratories. He was head of the graphic imaging group there. And these images were coming in from Mars, from the Viking. We went in the dead of night under the influence of God knows what to look at these pictures coming in, and it was like a holy moment for me. I just sort of collapsed and said, I don't know what this is, but whatever it is, I want a piece of it. And from there we went to a little company that he and another man at Battelle founded called Cybervision. It was a little personal computer based on an 1802 chip that was used in the Apollo mission, I believe. It had very fat bits, as you can see from this imagery. We had 2K of usable RAM. We loaded at 200 baud from cassette tape. And I did animation and lip syncing because I didn't know any better. So I actually reinvented cell animation during this period. That's how I got involved in this business. And at the same time, I was working on my master's degree in theater and later my PhD. So I want to now introduce the metaphor of the map a little more strongly, and I'll be using more maps than pictures as I go through this with you. This is the map then to computers as theater, and you can see that I thought of it as a chance intersection, the technology and humanities work that I was doing. So we start with, as I said, acting and improv. In directing, which was my other MFA major, I discovered during, go back a few years. I masqueraded as a political science student to get myself on a trip to the Soviet Union for a year when I was in college. And that was so I could have funding and an interpreter and stuff. And I was actually looking at underground theater in the Soviet Union. But while I was in Eastern Europe, I got to see Lanterna Magica in Prague. And these guys were doing amazing things. I can remember a scene where an actor was dancing across the stage with a sphere, and on that sphere was projected another woman dancing, and it tracks perfectly. There were people coming in and out of screens and moving through elastic scrim into live theater in the same clothing, and it was just remarkable transformational experience for me to see the use of technology that these guys were doing. Now that was 1971. So moving back to the days of my higher education, the participatory theater movement that I mentioned in the beginning, the big hits there were the Living Theater, if you recall. Some of you do, I know, you're old enough to recall, where the actors went marching out into the audience and wandered around, and then the audience was invited to come up on stage, and most people felt like geeks because they'd never done that before, or else they said inappropriate things. Dionysus in '69 was another one of those, and actually the most successful of them was Hair, where people were actually into it, because by then we were, totally up to speed as hippie nation, and it didn't feel weird to anybody anymore. I also had a great, Mr. Glancy was a magnificent theater teacher. And you can see, I've already talked to you about the influence of the Commedia dell'arte and the medieval theater on my early work. The business of mansion staging is a metaphor that I often think of when I think about UI design, that there's a story going on and we're going from place to place in the world rather than having a place going on where there are separate stories. It's an interesting inversion. The Greek theater, my major focus of study was Aristotle. I'm a hardcore structuralist, always will be. One of the things about the Greek theater that struck me then and carries through my life and work was that it was the theater of Dionysus, and that the actors were priests of Dionysus, and that going to the theater was a civic duty, a civic event. Nobody went to see Aeschylus plays because they wanted to see how they turned out. Nobody wanted to know, how it turned out for Oedipus. Everybody knew these stories, but the theater was, the plays were commissioned or performed according to the temper of the times. So you end up with Aristophanes' comedies coinciding with wars that needed attention. The priests of Dionysus then had a sacred duty to perform their parts well. And I remember when I went on stage as an actor, I would always say, may I do good by doing this now, whatever it is, even if it was a bad guy, especially if it was a bad guy. But in a way, that's been at the heart of what I do since that time. So Aristotle was my main man. Brecht was also important to me. I did a couple of Brechtian performances at McAllister College, and I learned about it's different from participatory theater in a funny way. In Brechtian theater, as I'm sure you know, the job of the actor and of the play is to hand the torch to the audience, and the action of the play is completed in the polis, in the city, by the citizens, by the action that they take that's been induced by the play. So in both of these models, in the Brechtian theater and in the Commedia dell'arte, there's this kind of responsibility to be relevant in addition to performing the play. That really stuck with me. Now, looking down at the technology side, I've told you about cybervision, and you saw the fat bits. I went to Atari, which was, the most interesting thing about going to Atari in late 79, early 80, was that I was the first woman in the home computer division. And I remember going to the ladies' restroom that first day, and I opened the door, and there were like 30 guys in there smoking dope. And I said, dudes, I'm a woman, and I have to go to the bathroom. Could you please clear out? So that was interesting. But the more interesting thing was meeting Alan Kay. Just as I was about to get fired from the Atari product group because I was just too much trouble, I was saying things like, I won't spend 80% of my budget porting Pac-Man to the Atari 800. It makes no fucking sense, dude. We've got banking, personal improvement, education, all these categories hanging open, and you want to port a video game that's already running better on your own game machine? What? So I opened my mouth. I started to get fired. I ran over to Alan Kay's office, and I said, Alan, I'm going to lose my job in about 20 minutes. Will you take me? He said, yes. Change of life. He's a marvelous fellow. They had stolen him from Park, by the way. Now you'll see the little town of Norman on the map. It's named after a fellow in the audience. The little town of Norman was where I got some encouragement for the ideas I was having outside of the domain of my crazy advisor. The little town of Norman encouraged me to write papers and actually publish them in a book. And I thank you, Don, and I thank you for staying my friend this long. And Don wrote me an email the other day. He said, God, I finally understand computers as theater. It was like, great, dude, you wrote the preface, what? Anyway, at Atari Labs, I met magnificent people, Eric Haltine, who's also here. It was an amazing collection of mostly MIT geeks and a few of us who got in under the wire from Atari itself. But I was bombarded by all these insanely smart people who were talking about presence and remote presence and gestural interfaces and things that I'd never thought of before walked in that door, and I was able to bathe in that scene. Michael Neymark had a profound influence on me, and Rachel Strickland, who was there, also became an important collaborator in my life. Then I went to Activision when you recall Atari was taken over by Jabba the Hutt about then, right? At least that's what the people from Lucasfilm called him. And so I went to Activision and I got to produce Rich Gold's game, Little Computer People. Are you familiar? Who's familiar with Little Computer People? Oh, not many. Okay. So the game was, there was this little guy in his apartment, and you were looking at it in a kind of plan, like a little proscenium play. And he had a living room with a piano and a kitchen with a refrigerator, and upstairs he had a bed and curtains and stuff. And the trick was that you needed to take care of him. You needed to get him out to the grocery and get him to get up in the morning and have something to eat. And if you really interacted with him, he would go down and play the piano. And the problem with this game, of course, was when the salesman took it to trade shows, he always died because they wouldn't take care of him. So they'd go to demo the thing, and the guy was dead. He was green. He was in his bed, right? So we had to build a special version for the sales force that would not die, the immortal little computer person. But I mean, talk about inspiration for a book about computers as theater. Watching this little autonomous dude with whom I was interacting was just like incredibly important. And you know, Rich Gold worked here at Park until his death. He was head of the Artist in Residence program and just a terrific guy. So another strong influence. And then we get to Apple and the Human Interface Group, where a lot of people from the Atari labs kind of moved over there. We have this little cadre of people who now soon will have walkers at events like this, who moved through all these labs more or less together. The Human Interface Group at Apple exposed me to a whole bunch of folks, again, who had ideas about UI, and many of them drawn from the old human factors profession. But I got a chance to survey all those ideas because I was preparing a book, I was editing a book for the lab. I mentioned the Guides project, and there are two miscreants right here who were involved with that, Tim Warren and Abby Dunn. This was the project to create human-like agents to help people navigate a database of information, an encyclopedia about westward movement in America. And I got to play around with that team for a while. So the cool thing about Guides was that there were these 4 different characters that you could choose to help you navigate. And one of them was like an old mule skinner kind of guy, and there was me, the pioneer lady, because I got to do some acting in the thing. And there was an Indian. I think we had to cast that one a couple times because the first guy was like a day late for his meeting or something. He was running on Indian time or Apple time. Anyway, that showed me, it reified my belief that having different points of view through a certain crowd of information was really important. And that's about the time I learned the metaphor of the model view controller idea that came from Park here, where you have this big wad of information, a sphere of information, let's call it the Bible of Star Trek, just as an example. And then you have these different controllers. Maybe over here you have an episode of TNG. It's going to shoot a certain path through that wad of information. Or you've got a major film, and it's going to shoot another path through it, and a path of a different shape and size. And then you have all these paperbacks nibbling around, but you can't really mess with the Star Trek Bible. That's why it's a good example, except for J.J. Abrams, whom I will kill with my bare hands if I ever get the chance for blowing up Vulcan. All right, so all of those thoughts and all of those people were part of what made me extrude this first book and got me on my way, and I promise to talk more quickly. What I learned from that whole journey was that it was really important for me, at least the way my brain works, to see through structure. In other words, to use the gorgeous structural lens of Aristotle's Poetics, or Brecht's theory of theater works just as well because it's systematic, and to see through experience, right? We weren't talking about experience design in those days, although we all knew that was what we were doing. I think we just hadn't thought of the buzzword yet. So the book came out, And then they put it out in paperback so I could whine about the disappearance of virtual reality in the preface. And now we're going to a northern land of Canada, Banff, Alberta, where the attempt was, Rachel Strickland and I had become really close during the work I just described at Atari and at Apple. And so we decided, damn it, we'd seen this virtual reality stuff, you know, we'd seen it demoed by NASA guys, we'd seen it on the news. What would it be like if we could really get in there? You know, that's what I was trying to do in my dissertation. Can I walk into the cartoon? Can I be the inverse Roger Rabbit? You know, how does this work? How can I get inside a world? And so this is a map of that particular journey. And that's Banff, where it started. And we started with a question about authorship. So you've created a world. You know, when you were using a branching tree structure of choice, which we did in the old days in doing games, somebody had to have thought of, you know, every terminus, every branch. And so it was a very constrained piece of authorship that I would still call formal. But when you get into a situation where individuals can walk as free agents around a world, then you can't control the form of their experience the way you can with a very tightly constrained set of choices. So what is an author to do? And if you're an Aristotelian, what you do is you work from the material causality vector up. That is, you create visions and architectures and sounds and circumstances and situations that predispose people to have interesting journeys, so that when they look back on their trip through their virtual reality experience, it had a good plot. That's how you share authorship with a free agent in an environment. Rachel and I were interested in the relationship between landscape and stories, which is a fairly green thing to do, I suppose. And we were both total fans of Barry Lopez, so we set out to Banff to build something. It involved notions of architecture, and point of view was really tricky in VR. The Teatro Olimpico again, right? You've got to worry about parallax. But more than anything, you have to worry about, there's the technical stuff, parallax and foveation and all that jazz. But the point of view, you can't construct one of these worlds from any single point of view. So the author doesn't get to do it like a painting or like a computer graphic on a computer screen. It's an entirely different art, I discovered. We had a great collaborative team. I guess we discovered in the course of designing the virtual world that we built was that hundreds of people weren't going to see it. Thousands of people weren't going to see it. We could maybe get 100 people in there and do a lot of documentation. So why were we doing this? Well, we were doing it as a design statement. And I'll say a little more about that in the technology section. So we looked a lot at the senses. I did a lot of research in the science of proprioception, for example. Now we're down on the bottom in the technology territory in the little town of Leary. Dr. Tim I was his producer, strangely enough, when he was doing video games. He had done a game for Electronic Arts, and I inherited him at Activision, and he never actually did anything while I was there, but I hung out with him a lot. And he, he was like, yeah, diving to the dream, right on. He was a real cheerleader for the effort and introduced me to a lot of cool and interesting people who ended up helping. So the town of Leary is on the map. I finally got my head in VR at NASA Ames, where Scott Fisher was working in the lab, and we had the famous glove, right-handed glove, and Sally Rosenthal back there was the poster girl for that. There's this great picture of her pointing with her hair streaming back because she's in the dream at NASA. And these worlds were created first with vectors and then with polygons. So it was pretty standard what was going on there. We questioned, Rachel and I, the notion of the glove and the symbolic language because we were about ripping off and repurposing the whole medium. The medium at that point was used for training, for astronauts and stuff. And by the way, you could get a pull-down menu by making a gesture. So It's like, why the fuck did we make a three-dimensional space you could move around in if you had to select things from a menu? What's up, you know? As Eric Altine once said, the first time a speech interface would show up in Mac Draw, the sentence it would recognize would be, move the little hand up, you know? It was that kind of stupid. So we learned a lot. We learned that for immersion to happen, you needed more of your body. And forgive me if you've heard this story before, but in the original VR world, you had the glove for the, sorry, keep using my left hand. You had the glove for the gestural interface and the pointing. Direction of movement was taken from a sensor on the helmet. So movement and gaze were the same thing, essentially, in most of the early systems. So you would have a body that was doing this kind of thing, and it would be making specific hand gestures and occasionally checking the menu. So what we did was we gave people two hands, and we took direction of movement from the pelvis, because the pelvis never lies about which way you're going, and direction of gaze from the head. So instead of this, we had this. You know, there was a completely different experience of the body in the virtual space because of those two hacks. The little town of Tau is there. Rob was probably wrote most of the code for that project, and also demonstrated to us when we had things deeply wrong. I should say that in response to the polygons at the beginning of this map, we experimented, along with Michael Neymark, with several different ways of capturing environments and putting them in virtual worlds that weren't polygons. One of them was a polygon world, but its major characteristic was auditory. We used three-dimensional audio to represent that place. Another was video on a mocked-up relief projection, right? In other words, we had video of a waterfall projected onto a polygonal shape that was the shape of the waterfall. So you could get the parallax right, and you could see the movement. And then we did some tiled imagery with video. Again, the hack here was to repurpose the medium and to be able to tell the story and show the pictures that this thing is a dream machine. It's not just a training tool. And we thought that was really important. I think we got hijacked to a certain extent by the notion of desktop VR, which wasn't VR. It was a desktop. Thanks. And the cave, even to a certain extent, kind of watered down the experience. There were also economic problems with it, but it was a glorious moment to discover what was possible with 13 computers. The first reality engine off the production line, all the way down to an early MacBook, was involved in the making of this thing. And here are some images from it real quick. You can see the waterfall on the top. One of the things that we did was, so you didn't feel particularly embodied in the training video version of VR. There wasn't men would say they were having an out-of-body experience. Women who experienced it tended to say they were taking their bodies to a different place, which presaged a lot of gender research that I did later. So in order to make it explicit that you had a body, before you even discovered you could do all this stuff, you entered a cave and you had to poke, if you poked your head inside of the vision of one of these animals, we had a snake and a crow and a spider, that you would become that animal, and you'd have its motor capabilities and its sensorium, et cetera, to the extent that we could do it. And the point there was to just remind us all that we had bodies in space. We also had a two-user system, which I think was the first time that had been done with a theatrical set, so that people watching would have a sense of the theater of it. Rutland, I don't know why I chose this map, except it's pink. Quickly. This is work I did at Interval with Rob and another large team, looking at gender and technology. And having noticed that these differences that I just mentioned, for example, between males and female users of a virtual world, and having sat around in the computer game industry for 10 years or whatever, dealing with these obnoxious war games, and not being able to change anybody's mind about. Interval gave me the opportunity to explore gender and technology, so I was off on another journey. I learned about ethnographic research. We interviewed over 1,000 kids in 8 major cities in the US. I think it was a boo-boo not to interview rural kids. But what we found was remarkable consistency among kids between 7 and 12 all over the country. Remarkable, almost eerie consistency around issues even of race. And the only place where we saw anything strange was in my hometown of Indianapolis, where kids constantly wanted to tell us that their parents beat them up, which was hard. It's weird and funny. We also looked at art styles. For me, I made a discovery, I guess, looking at the land of ethics and strategy and tactics here that come up on the map. My discovery was that as I proceeded through this research, I had 2 big grand strategic goals, okay? That one of them was, in fact, to create software and an experience that would get girls' hands on one of these, because they weren't doing it in those days. This is 1992 to 1996. The boys were in the computer lab, the girls were sitting in the back. You know, it wasn't happening. Part of it was that the web wasn't there. There was not much that attracted them. But boys had learned, as David Liddell used to like to say, that if you pounded the return key 80 times, something would happen. Whereas girls were thinking, I'll break it, you know. So one strategic goal was to figure out what it would take to build something that would help begin to solve that problem, that would be so compelling that a girl would reach through this screen and dive into a dream and make an interface easy enough to seduce her into doing that. We learned a lot of things about learning curves and brain-based gender differences, which we could not have talked about in the 80s because it was inappropriate. And the other grand strategic goal I had was to create content for these experiences that actually intervened in the lives of preteen girls in a positive way. And one of the things I learned from looking at them was that they have a certain sense of inevitability about what happens to them in social situations. I don't know if any of you have little girls, or have had, I bet you have, between 8 and 12 was what I was looking at. And as they get closer to teenhood, it's like, oh, I blew it today. I knew it was going to happen. I couldn't do it. And there's all this horrible angst and a sense that nothing else could have happened. There's no sense of free will. And what we discovered that, in addition to that, was the girls would hang in groups of 3 and just take turns excluding each other, which happens to adult women too. Some of you might recognize this pattern. So the idea was to provide an emotional rehearsal space for these kids where they could actually experiment with what if I did it this way? You know, maybe whining works. Am I going to cry now? Am I going to walk out of the room? There wasn't a way to win these games. There were just different experiences you could have in them. There was no training objective, except that we brought up issues like somebody asked me to smoke a cigarette, or my dad, who is divorced from my mom, won't come to Father's dance, or somebody stole my diary. You know, I mean, problems that kids really have, and tried to deal with them straight on. So there were 2 different missions there. 2 grand strategies served by the same strategy, which was to build some games for little girls. In technology land, we were in the days of computer literacy, I'm sure you all remember. But games meant things where you could win or lose, and things that had a clock. And I think they still do. And I think when we use that word game to talk about computer entertainment in general, we're doing ourselves a disservice because we're not looking at all the shades of gray. And I'm sure you can think of examples where there are not clocks, where there are not scores, and people just love doing it. A lot of social gaming is that way. We learned that in those days the platform really mattered, that girls thought that a personal computer was for anybody, but a game machine was for boys. And it was a really overwhelmingly convincing evidence. So we made choices about the platform on that basis. We came up with an idea that I thought really worked for the time and for the capabilities of the computer. And yes, we did have branching tree structure in the choices there. It was called emotional navigation. So you could, instead of getting questions that you answered. You would see the face of the character with different expressions. You could scroll over those faces, you'd hear thoughts, and you'd decide which way you felt. And that's how you got around in the games. So again, it was about giving girls emotional rehearsal space. And then I learned all about distribution, which I won't bore you with, except to say that the way the company died was because it had real inventory, real goods, CD-ROMs in this case. And there were all these shiny new companies that didn't have any, requirements for valuation based on inventory. They didn't even have business plans, so our investors all ran over to the web. But we did do some web work in Purple Moon that was pioneering. We created a really powerful social network for the girls that belonged to the community. So powerful that 280 girls joined it after we had shut it down by going in through somebody else's bookmarks. We were beating Disney.com for months on end. We created web objects that had scarcity, and you will see those at work in your lives now. And we also used tangibles. So it was a transmedia project. It addressed people in many different ways. So that was Purple Moon, and here are some of the things we made. We called it a cultural intervention. David Liddell contests the fact that I invented this notion that a cultural intervention is a way of introducing new genetic material into a culture without activating its immune system. That if you want to change something about culture with what you're doing, you got to be really careful, right? You have to worm it in there and meet people where they are, not where you'd like them to be, and treat them like who they are, not who you think they might be, because you're like that, This is the reason why we do design research. I also enslaved my children to go to E3 to launch this stuff. This is the daughter who just gave us a grandson, spinning a giant locker, and here are the products. Now, the cunning thing about this was that I got to write a book about it, and so when I still get letters from girls who play these games. They're like, oh, I'm a junior and I'm studying design at Foo College, and I'll send them this book and I'll get to say, here's how the sausage was made, and here are all the questions we had to ask. And it's a wonderful way to sort of close the loop on that conversation. I won't talk about higher ed now because I don't want to take up more of your time. I'll just put this slide up and you can read it yourselves. If there's one thing I'd foreground, it's in design at least. Providing students with end-to-end process has been an incredibly successful technique for me. So starting with a basic territory that you want to explore and ending with a suite of products and with a grand strategic goal that you've met and products, services, nonprofits, whatever, and a way to talk about it convincingly. That's what I mean by end-to-end, and there are a lot of steps in between. And one of them we have forgotten as a community until at least 5, 6, 10 years ago maybe, is the incredible importance of human-centered design research, where you're not just looking at response times in a lab, but you're going out and talking to people and doing home visits and really understanding who your audience is. Okay, here's my last map. This map comes from Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels. And you will recognize it if you ever go to Mendocino. You'll notice I finally had the nerve to tack sciences up on the humanities territory because I couldn't leave it out anymore. It feels so silly. And that's just a warning that there are monsters. This trip is the one I'm still on, and a lot of threads have followed through. I'm going to start with the tech first. The advent of distributed sensing has been of huge importance to me, and I'm incredibly curious about it. Last time I spoke here, I talked about driving simulations from real-world sensors, and there's a lot of that going on now. Sometimes you combine data, you mash up real-world sense data with other kinds of data to make a simulation. Distributed computing, which I assume you're all familiar with, the SETI project, the protein folding stuff, etc. A very passive sort of way to collaborate. And one of the things I learned while I was investigating it as a UI is just horrible. Horrible. Go try to join SETI online and see what you have to go through. and see what kind of data they'll show you after you've spent all this time dealing with it. The things that mobile devices can do, all the embedded sensors in there. This is another huge change in the landscape that's happened very recently. I mean, in my time, at 62-year-old time, it's very recent. Augmented reality displays. One of the things that dismays me, that has dismayed me, is the early things that we've done with see-through displays. You know, fucking yelping a restaurant or looking down the street to see where you can get a good pizza. When you could look at tectonic plates or, you know, microbiology or birds, for heaven's sakes. We're stuck in the consumerist spectacle, it seems, in the things that we apply our new affordances to. And if there's anything I'm about right now, it's not doing that anymore. You know, I did my little dance with the consumer market, and I'm done with that. Life is too short. We're citizens, and we have important work to do. I'm sorry, preaching. Participatory sensing is the newest and most exciting thing I know about. And I'm sure if you're aware of it, you know some of the projects that are going on. I'm working on a grant proposal with some friends at UCSC and other colleges to do some work with participatory sensing and public interactive installations in parks. Because I think it's a new way to see the world. When you're looking through the eyes of 100,000 people, I mean, how do you even represent that? What does that look like? I can remember talking to Barry Lopez about the vanishing point in painting, the perspective painting, and he said, it's so interesting that when you have a painting that doesn't have a vanishing point, in America at least they call it primitive art, when in fact they should be calling it community art, because it's lots of eyes looking at lots of places and someone has made us a representation. That's such a beautiful challenge. And I haven't seen anybody really meet it yet. So it's like, what does the display look like when you're in a participatory sensing situation? What are the rules? What are the metrics? How do we want to see it? How do we want to be embodied in it or not? There are some clues out there that I won't bore you with, but I think it's a really, really interesting question. And it goes to just ways of seeing. Now the monsters, for me, there's one monster, and that's climate change. I think there's some monstrosities in our political system that the consumerist society is a monstrosity, that a lot of the things we do are monstrous. But the big fire-breathing monster is climate change. Because it is happening, because we are not dealing with it, we're not even preparing for it. And that won't change until people's view of this slow-moving giant monster changes. So how do we make the monster visible? How do we make the things that we might do possible, imaginable, you know, to attenuate at least the effects of this monster that's coming? How can we get people who are in denial about this to fall in love with this planet again and the things that grow on it? Well, participatory sensing starts to give me some ideas about that. Because, you know, hope is the only good working hypothesis for anything, right? So this notion of othering nature has something to do with climate denial. And I think if we're designing affordances for our technology to look at the natural world, we need to think carefully about how we position the natural world so that there is a continuity between ourselves and what we call nature. It's the othering of nature that's brought us to a lot of ugly passes, I think. Similarly, the othering of technology. To say that technology is not an extrusion of the human spirit is to give yourself an opportunity to make excuses for what goes on, right? We don't say that about telescopes. So why do we say it about computers? You know, it's not reasonable. It's not a productive way to think about the context that we're in. We have agency. We live in a community. We live in a global community. And we can influence policy by the things that we do with the affordances at hand. Policies that are productive of the good in society. And I think that has to start with an appreciation of our context, both in terms of nature and technology. I've spoken about the spectacle and I've talked a little bit about the challenges in information representation. I guess what I'm advocating at the end of the day, it sounds vague, and it will be for a long time, but I know a lot of people who are working on it, is this notion of Gaian gardening, that we have this planet that has a tendency towards homeostasis, that relies on things like species diversity, carbon emissions, etc. There are many variables that have to do with keeping this a living entity with lots of little pieces, and we are some of those little pieces, right? So to garden for that, it's not to leave it alone and let it go wild and let the weeds take over and let the climate do whatever it wants. It's to care for it and love it as we should be loving ourselves, as we love our children. So what does technology then, the technology that you and I design for individual people, for groups, what does it have to do? How can we apply it to that notion of both seeing our planet that way and of taking care of it well? So I'm headed for New Albion, and I'm sorry if I talk too long, but I wanted to give you a picture of that journey, and I'll give you just a little something else here if I can. This is just the journey to New Albion. This is the cave in Albion. You can hear the waves on the outside, and we're playing Tibetan bowls in there, and we do crazy things like that. So this is my Gaian experience, I guess. My husband and I do these binaural recordings in natural venues. Anyway, thank you for listening to me ramble, and I hope to visit with all of you soon.
Your hand if you want to have the mic brought to you.
So Brenda, I'm afraid I have to inject a note of pessimism dealing with your final comments.
Yes.
And I'm reading a book right now called The Righteous Mind. I don't know if you've seen it.
I have not
But
seen
it's
it.
by a moral psychologist who's trying to understand and explain why people take the emotional views they do. And that's distressing enough. But one of the main contentions in his book from actual research on people, much like ethnographers do, is that people are not rational beings, but in fact are very quick response emotional beings and use rationalism to rationalize their emotional views.
Mm-hmm.
And, so I don't know where to go with this, but it seems like we're kind of lost in a sea where Karl Rove understands things better than all of us rationalists do.
Gyre. I don't know. I think he's got his nemesis coming. But if I didn't say it clearly enough, what I mean to be advocating for is emotional experiences with the planet, with the plants, with the animals. Like our friend Sean White built this beautiful app called Leaf Snap, where you take a picture of a leaf and you identify the tree. It's like, whoa. And that goes way back for me. When we did Robin Hood at Ohio State and the kids would come in, I'd say, they'd say, what kind of tree is that? And I'd say, well, this is an oak tree in Sherwood Forest. And that's the first time they'd ever seen an oak leaf. They really looked at it, It's that kind of engagement with our planet that I'm trying to lift up. And I understand it won't change the world. It's just what I want to do right now in my time that's left to me. And I agree with you. If we don't give people emotional experiences of the wonders of this place, then how can we expect them to have the kind of far-reaching views we need them to have? Yep.
To having read a Utopian Entrepreneur like quite a while ago, it was nice to be reminded about kind of the principle in the Purple Moon games of social rehearsal and rehearsing the social, and it feels very sort of touching to think about that now, because it seems like, given the speed of our interpersonal communications, that we don't rehearse anymore, that we go live right away.
Right.
And as a mom now, I think about that a lot, about how we're going to adapt to teach for that kind of world. And I was wondering if those games, if they said anything to you about that, if you learned anything about that.
Oh, I don't know. I think not having a clock, not having a win, gave people a chance to dwell in those games, to just dwell and not feel pressured to move forward or to get to the end. And I think similarly, I remember Alan Kay's early sketches of the Dynabook. We had an artist come into Atari Lab and draw pictures of what the Dynabook would do. And there'd be a little girl by the seashore and there'd be seagulls and things on her screen. She'd be looking at the sky. And now we've got Star Walk on our iPhones. If you haven't seen this app, you just must. It's a place you can dwell. You can point the thing at the sky and see the names of the stars and the constellations. You can see the ones that are under the horizon right now. There are tools like that, and there are more and more of them where you can dwell with seeing, with learning. And the more of them we make for younger people, I think the better they'll do, in terms of being able to breathe and using technology in ways that doesn't force that quickness. It doesn't address the social rehearsal question, but I think it does address something about the pressure of going live, as you say. That's a really good phrase. I'm going to steal it.
So I'll take the last question, just because I wanted to ask, when you present your career, you're showing yourself having traveled the world and really blazed a trail, having
Rutland, I've never been to
having
Rutland.
Don Norman as a tutor, to tutor you, as well as Alan Kay, and a lot of amazing opportunities. And then your penultimate slide said that we can now educate people. And it seemed to me that you were indicating that so much of what you've learned about maintaining an understanding of both the psychology, the theater, and the economics of the world, something that you learned through traveling the whole globe, is now effectively to students?
I think it is. I really do. I've seen it work. I've run and taught in graduate programs for 12 years. At CCA, 92% of my graduates were out there working either as UX strategists or designers or entrepreneurs successfully, and the other 8% were contractors. The first consulting job I got after I quit CCA was from one of my students at Art Center, who has a successful company in Los Angeles. So, people are educable to do transmedia design, to do design research, to think in systemic ways, to put the pieces together in a way that carries values and ethics along with it every step. I've seen it happen. I know it works, and I've seen it happen other places too. It's not just my programs. So the important thing here for me is that it's the kids who come in with a liberal arts education who are most likely to succeed. And so those of you who have young people, don't ever turn away from that liberal arts degree, and don't let your child get a BFA if you can help it, because it's the breadth of humanities and science and ethics that all come into play in that end-to-end process. So the more they know about it, the less you have to teach them when you got them in the classroom.
Well, thank you. That's very inspiring.
Thank you.
I'll give you a brief intro.
Take it.